Welcome to the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation's inaugural program of 2022. I'm your host, Gleaves Whitney, Executive Director of the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Foundation. Today's program is being co-hosted with our good friends and partners at the Gerald R. Ford Library and Museum, whose director I'll be introducing later in the program. But first, let's go ahead and get into the topic. January 20th. Every 4 years, it's the day that is constitutionally scheduled for the President of the United States to be sworn in or sworn at. In the inauguration of a president, there is always a polar tension between continuity and change, conservation and innovation. What do we keep as a country? What do we reform as a country? Well, with us to help with some of these compelling questions is Dr. Thomas Balcerski, a native of New Jersey. He currently serves as Associate Professor of History at Eastern Connecticut State University. He's a scholar of early American history, and he holds Bachelor of Arts degree from Cornell University, Master's of Arts from the State University of New York, Stony Brook, and a PhD in history from Cornell University. His research interests include the US presidents and first ladies. And you're starting to see him, no doubt, more and more on C-SPAN and other programs. He's also a live commentator for the Washington Post during Inauguration Day of 2021. And he was a participant in the most recent 2021 C-SPAN survey of presidential leadership. His new project, his latest passion, is exploring the history of the Democratic Party, America's oldest partisan institution. We are really excited to have you on board, Tom. Thank you very much for joining us.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, Gleaves. I'm really excited to share with you some of my research and to field some questions from some of your audience members.
Thank you.
All right. Well, I think I'm going to share my screen, so allow me to do that. All right. Well, again, good evening, everybody. And I'm so happy to be able to be here today presenting to the Gerald Ford Foundation. I will mention President Ford as part of today's presentation, but I hope also to put his experience into something of a historical context, as he, as we all know, experienced one of the most unusual inaugurations in American history. My presentation tonight is titled Notably Absent, Presidential No-Shows and Other Mishaps on Inauguration Day. Now, since 1789, the inauguration of a president has marked the beginning of a new chapter in American history. But what happens when an outgoing president decides not to participate in the transfer of power from one administration to the next? And how often have presidents, for one reason or another, missed the inaugurations of their successors? As it turns out, presidential absence on Inauguration Day has been more frequent than we, and certainly I, might have expected. 5 outgoing presidents, John Adams, John Quincy Adams, Martin Van Buren, Andrew Johnson, and Donald Trump, failed to attend the inauguration of their successors, while 2 more presidents, Woodrow Wilson and Richard Nixon, did not participate for other reasons. More than 36 presidential transitions have taken place since the founding of the Republic, which makes notable these 7 instances of absent incumbents. Taken together, they reveal how inaugural no-shows are in fact a recurring feature of American politics. In 1796, George Washington announced that he would not seek another term as president, having filled 2 terms in the office. The election to name his successor pitted Federalist John Adams, his vice president, against Democratic Republican Thomas Jefferson, Secretary of State during Washington's first term. In a sectional split, Adams won the Electoral College by a margin of 71 to 68 votes. But under the term of the Constitution, Jefferson became his vice president, a very awkward moment. Hopes for cooperation between the 2 men fizzled, and the factions only deepened by the election of 1800, which was famously a rematch. In that election, we saw one of the most acrimonious in American history to that point, certainly. Jefferson's Democratic Republicans, on his behalf, attacked Adams as a monarchist, while the Federalists attacked what might be a lawless and godless Jefferson administration in their view. And the voting process was also very fraught in that election, because this was before the passage of the 12th Amendment. We'd already seen how a president and vice president from opposite sides had to serve together. But what about the possibility of a tie? And it's a complex and convoluted history, but we do get a deadlock in the Electoral College due to something of a mishap between who would be president and vice president. We're talking about Jefferson, who was supposedly the clear winner, but actually he tied with Aaron Burr, who was supposed to be vice president. Because of this deadlock in the House, the balloting continued and continued, and eventually it was only broken after Adams, by the way, the president refused to be involved after many ballots, and Jefferson becomes president, Burr vice president. The 12th Amendment will fix that. So now, of course, we've got this outgoing president, John Adams, and this incoming president, Thomas Jefferson, who are at loggerheads with each other. And it was on March 4th, 1801, the day set aside for Inauguration Day under the Constitution, that John Adams decided to leave very early in the morning, probably at 4 a.m., in fact, on a stagecoach, headed back for his home of Massachusetts. And historians still debate why it is that John Adams chose to leave and to not stay. For one thing, there was no place assigned to him in the ceremonies, and for another, he had just lost a presidential election. It does speak to John Adams's somewhat stubborn character. But in any case, he had set a very unfortunate precedent in the process, whereby an outgoing president who had lost an election did not attend the inauguration of his successor at the Capitol, which this image shows us an early version of the Capitol before it was capped and expanded to our present day. Which brings us to our next moment of presidential no-show. That's son of John Adams, John Quincy Adams, and his election in which he lost to Andrew Jackson, also a rematch from a prior year in 1829. So when Andrew Jackson came to the Capitol to be inaugurated as president in 1829, everyone knew that something big was happening. There was a shift in parties between Jackson and Adams. This is between the so-called National Republicans, which had kind of been in power for a period, and this new Democratic Party that was emerging under Jackson. The election of 1824 was particularly acrimonious as well, also led to a split and a deadlock in the Electoral College, and thus the House of Representatives decided eventually the election for Adams, who in turn famously or infamously appointed Henry Clay as Secretary of State. This fueled the issues of the election of 1828, which again was a rematch, this time just Adams versus Jackson, the incumbent versus the challenger, and indeed Jackson will win that election. Now, Jackson arrives in the Capitol in February, and again, Adams is completely unhelpful. He does not in any way provide for a transition. He won't meet with Jackson, and indeed, he makes it known that he's not going to be present for Inauguration Day. On March 3rd, 1829, fully a day before his own father's example, 28 years earlier, John Quincy Adams departed Washington, left the White House, but didn't leave for, I should say, left the White House, not Washington. He didn't leave for Massachusetts like his father. He actually stayed on in the Capitol at a rented home of David Porter, actually. And so in the process, then it was even more of an insult, because here you now have someone who doesn't need to get home or anything. He just doesn't want to be there. And so the Jackson people who were planning this inauguration purposely left a seat vacant for John Quincy Adams, labeled the outgoing president, which will be a feature, as we shall see, in the next absence ahead. And I have on the screen here the picture of what is perhaps the most famous moment of the inauguration of Andrew Jackson. That is the large crowd that gathered at the White House after the inaugural to take part in a inaugural feast of a repast and refreshments. And it was such that the crowds nearly crushed to death the Duke president, who had to escape through a window. The White House was trashed, and it was only apparently the allure of tubs of alcoholic orange punch placed on the south lawn that drew the crowds away. So I mentioned that there was another instance of a presidential absence down the road, and it's in the same era between the Democrats under Andrew Jackson and their opposition. Now, by this time in 1840, this opposition will take the form of the Whig Party, and their first successful candidate to win the presidency is William Henry Harrison. Now, Harrison was running against Martin Van Buren, who had succeeded Andrew Jackson and thus was an incumbent. So when Van Buren lost, actually, now we have a third instance where an incumbent from a different party does not attend his successor's inauguration. The thing that makes the Van Buren absence somewhat different than the two Adamses is essentially Van Buren was willing to attend Harrison's inauguration, but no place was made for him. In fact, there was a very curt letter sent to the outgoing president from an inaugural committee in the Senate composed to very much just for the moment for Harrison's inauguration. And the quote is, "No position, it will be perceived, has been assigned to you." Kind of passive aggressive way of saying there's no place for you there. So there's also the fact that Martin Van Buren's son, Martin Van Buren Jr., was quite ill right on the day of inauguration, day before. And there's also the fact that Van Buren had vacated the White House on the day before the inauguration. So there's some sort of similarities here to Van Buren's behavior to some of the other absences at this point. But I think the difference is that he would have attended. And of course, Harrison famously will give the longest inauguration in American history. It's also the first inaugural parade to take place in 1841, as we're seeing pictured here. And after just 30 plus days in office, William Henry Harrison dies, yielding our first vice president to become President John Tyler. So a kind of key moment in American history, the month of March 1841, repeating a pattern in the process. Which leads us to the inauguration of Ulysses S. Grant in 1869. Now, jumping ahead, we now have the Republican Party versus the Democratic Party in these elections, and that will be the pattern going forward. Grant will run as a Republican, and he'll be replacing nominally the vice president who became president under a Republican, that is Abraham Lincoln's vice president, Andrew Johnson. However, Andrew Johnson had been a Democrat previously, and part of his appeal to the ticket in 1864 was it would be a unionist fusion kind of platform, bringing a Republican Lincoln and a former Democrat Johnson, who was loyal to the Union. Now, Lincoln's unexpected assassination and death gives us President Johnson and a very, as we all know, tumultuous 3 years in office, where he's coming into conflict with his own party, presumably the radical Republican faction in the Congress, and he's impeached, the first president impeached in 1868. Grant, who had been temporarily appointed actually Johnson's Secretary of War, will have a falling out with Johnson over these very issues and will essentially have no relationship with Johnson by the election of 1868. So even though you have two Republicans supposedly from the same party, Grant's victory in the election of 1868 was not necessarily appreciated by Andrew Johnson. And indeed, members of Johnson's cabinet, many of whom had been holdovers from the Lincoln administration, also looked down on Grant. So there was no love lost between the Johnson administration and Ulysses S. Grant. And Gideon Welles, who was a Connecticut politician who had been a Democrat at one point, became a Republican and became Lincoln's Secretary of the Navy, stays on with Johnson. He kept a diary that tells us a little bit about the conflicts that were emerging in the Johnson cabinet about this question of attending Ulysses S. Grant's inauguration. And Welles writes that Grant, this is about Grant, with his narrow mind and intense malignity, might not consent to public inauguration in our presence. So here we see Gideon Welles blaming Grant ultimately for what's about to happen, which is to say Grant will refuse to call on Johnson when he arrives in the Capitol. And of course, Johnson felt that as president, he should be the one called upon. So we have, once again, an impasse. Now we're again quoting Gideon Welles when he's saying that he himself was encouraging Johnson to boycott Grant's inauguration, calling Grant an ignorant, vulgar man. So now finally it's inauguration day. There's going to be, again, no contact between Johnson and Grant, but William Henry Seward, Lincoln's Secretary of State, Johnson's Secretary of State, someone who I think attempted to bridge the gap at the very end, walks into the cabinet on March the 4th, 1869, and says, ought we not start immediately for the Capitol? And it was in that moment that Andrew Johnson refused, saying, quote, he was inclined to think we could finish up our work here by ourselves. And indeed, he does not attend Grant's inauguration, pictured here on the screen, and just walks out of the White House at noon, his term being over. So we now have our next instance of presidential absence, jumping ahead more than 50 years to the inauguration of Warren G. Harding in 1921. And as I mentioned, if we've already seen the Adams and Harrison and Grant fitting a pattern, this one is a little bit different, but actually has some of the same elements. Now, Woodrow Wilson was not running for re-election in 1920. However, he supported the Democratic candidate, James Cox of Ohio, the governor, Harding, the senator from Ohio, the Battle of Ohio, the election of 1920. And in it, therefore, the question would be, would Woodrow Wilson be gracious and receiving of the new incumbent, or would there be a kind of political difference between the two men that would get in the way? Well, Harding arrived in the Capitol relatively early, and there was time, therefore, for him to visit the White House. And indeed, the Wilsons invited the Hardings to a tea on March the 3rd, the day before the inauguration, which the Hardings attended. And on the morning of inauguration, on the day, I should say, it was known that Woodrow Wilson, by that point, who was seriously ill, having had a massive stroke 2 years earlier in office, and who walked with a cane, would not be able to negotiate the steps that would be required of him to get to the site at the Capitol where the swearing in would take place. And this was actually determined by his doctor, who made the determination. Wilson himself was actually game for making the walk, but the doctor, Dr. Grayson, said no. So then what they agreed upon was that the two men would ride in an open air automobile, the first time an automobile was used on Inauguration Day, to the Capitol. Now, Wilson very specifically looked dead ahead, did not wave, did not in any way emote, because he said, they're here for you, not for me. And so he looked like this sullen figure leaving, and that's what this picture captures so beautifully. But at the same time, the two men agreed that they would exit the automobile and walk in a side door of the Capitol, whereby Wilson, who was unable to walk steps very well, could take an elevator within the Capitol up to the president's room. He would be signing last minute legislation, which he did, but then also just ceremonially be able to be seen with the incoming president. But that's what Harding refuses to do. Harding, at the moment he arrives at the steps of the Capitol, on the east side of the Capitol, he jumps right out and he walks up those steps, bounds up those steps. Even though he was a man actually older than Woodrow Wilson, he was in much better health, and he just leaves him. And we know this because Edith Wilson, the first lady, who was riding with the incoming first lady, Florence Harding, records this in her memoir as she was being absolutely taken aback by this. And she blasted Harding for his insensitivity. Wilson kind of laughed it off. At this point, he was very much beyond the drama of politics and was ready to be retired, as he did. And they drove off to their new home on S Street, literally as Harding was being inaugurated. So he was out the door. Which brings us to Gerald Ford. And I think there's something about the Ford inauguration, or I should say the swearing in ceremony, taking the oath of office, that now looks maybe a little different from some of the other examples. Because, of course, Vice President Ford at that time had been, first of all, not elected to the office, or only non-elected a person to become president or vice president, I should say, in that capacity. And when Richard Nixon makes the decision to resign on August the 8th, this means that Vice President Ford will become president. And again, there's no precedent here. The question would be, arguably then, should Richard Nixon stay? But of course, Nixon, in his own way, decided to leave the White House on August 9th at noon, at the time of his resignation, when it became effective, leaving on Marine One. And we have footage to show it. Don't have it on the screen here, but the Fords are there waving goodbye on the South Lawn, and the Nixons are going off. And everything appears amicable. And indeed, right inside, back in the East Room, we've got preparations happening for Ford's swearing in, and that's the picture here with Chief Justice Warren Burger administering the oath of office, Betty Ford standing right behind him. So whether or not, therefore, Nixon's absence should fit in the same category, something I'm sure we'll discuss later on, but I think it is part of a pattern of a president leaving office under circumstances whereby either the people have voted him out, which is the case of an incumbent, or in this case, he felt forced to resign his office. Now, I do want to focus a little bit on when President Ford left office, to also turn the table a bit on some of these presidential absences and discuss what might actually be a positive development from them before we get to our last one. So President Ford, after he had been defeated in the election of 1976, immediately committed to ensuring a smooth transition with his successor, Jimmy Carter. And these photos I'm going to show come from the White House photographer, Pulitzer Prize-winning photographer, David Hume Kennerly. And I want to thank him for first taking these and then keeping them posted on a website. So President Ford was so committed that President Carter be ready to begin his term on day one, hit the ground running, that for purposes of national security briefings, he sent his own CIA director, the future President George H.W. Bush. when after that first meeting between Ford and Carter, of course, it was a landmark moment because this had not happened actually previously very often. There's some other moments we'll talk about, I'm sure, of outgoing and incoming. They may have attended inauguration together, but there was no cooperation. President Ford committed to cooperating however he could, and President-elect Carter said as much. He said, quote, "There cannot have been a better demonstration of unity and friendship and goodwill than there has been shown to me by President Ford since the election. I believe that this year's debates and the election itself has reached a conclusion which leaves our country unified, and I have expressed many times in the last few weeks my deep appreciation for President Ford for the gracious way in which he has welcomed me." And indeed, on Inauguration Day, everyone gathered. Now it's January 20th, the day, 1977, for President-elect Carter's inauguration. And here they are. It's just one big happy family. It's the incoming and outgoing vice presidents and president in the Blue Room, in a picture that shows some people who are pretty prominent in the era. You've got, of course, the Carters and the Fords, as well as President Ford's vice president, Rockefeller, and President-elect Carter's vice president-elect, Mondale. So it's just almost, it's hard for us to imagine that this kind of photograph, of course, could take place today, because of course it didn't. And there's President Ford standing on the east face of the Capitol before we moved to the west face under President Reagan, but literally just standing right next to President Carter and supporting him in every possible way. I mean, it's an example that shines in American history. And it's been said that this set into motion what became for about 35 years a very smooth, with one exception, transition between outgoing and incoming presidents. And by the time we get to the transition between George W. Bush and Barack Obama, it's been described as the gold standard of presidential transitions. And it can be said that I think President Ford put into motion the true feeling behind that. So this leads us to our last and most recent episode of presidential absence on Inauguration Day, and that is, of course, during the election of 2020, the election between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. And without going through too many of the details of the election, it has to be said that the period following the actual election of 2020 was politicized, and the actual fate of the election was held in question for days, weeks, and months, and by some standards until the very Inauguration Day itself. Some of the dates that we may remember from this period was that the Electoral College met on December the 12th and tallied the vote of 306 for Biden to 232 for Trump, which was what certified the election, and by the Constitution set into motion the inauguration on January 20th of President-elect Biden. Nevertheless, one of the things we learned was on January 6th, there had to be a counting of the certified ballots. This is all under a somewhat obscure act we'll talk about, I'm sure, the Electoral Act of 1887, that has these various moments in place for really ceremony, counting, and certification. And it was on that day that President Trump held his Save America rally, where he encouraged those in attendance to march to the Capitol with him and to fight like hell. So the disruption of the counting did not stop the actual counting from taking place, as Congress, after the attack on the Capitol, resumed and in fact was able to continue and do its work, although there were objections raised, and the most that have ever been raised in any election, in fact. President-elect Biden was declared as such, therefore, on January 7th, which leads us then to the logic, perhaps, of President Trump's decision not to attend President-elect Biden's inauguration. He actually tweeted it out. He did not make a formal press conference about it. And there was a mixed reaction to it. There were some who said that this was a good thing for American democracy, others who thought that, once again, this absence was an unfortunate episode in American democracy. But we do know that not every member of the Trump administration did not attend. In fact, Vice President Pence attended the president's inauguration, President Biden. And really, again, we'll have to think about, therefore, what this means. I think it's still very fresh and raw for many of us to process this event. from a year ago, but that's why we're speaking tonight on the anniversary of President Biden's inauguration to try to make sense of it. So I think I'll stop there and turn it over to Gleaves for any questions you may have.
Thank you so much, Tom, for a very enlightening presentation about the good, the bad, and the ugly in America's inaugural history. And it really reflects the spirit of democracy in so many ways, our American democracy. Each one of these transitions teaches us something about our American democracy and sort of the state of our democracy at that particular point in time. Fascinating. I have a sort of a general question I'd like to ask all of our speakers. As you were doing all this research, all the research on all these different inaugurations, what surprised you most to discover?
Well, I have to say, just the number of presidents outgoing who did not attend their successors' inauguration. I mean, as someone who was born in the 1980s and really saw what were smooth transitions during my early lifetime between presidents in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, I had come to kind of expect, just by evidence of experience, my own life, that this was something that automatically happened, that indeed every outgoing president sort of by, if not by de facto, then by de jure, like literally had to attend, as if it was something required by the Constitution. And maybe the most shocking thing is it's not required. In fact, there's very few elements of Inauguration Day that are required. The only element actually, a couple elements, but the only elements to speak of are the oath of office itself, which is prescribed by the Constitution, and the timing of the actual inauguration, although it's changed, is part of the Constitution as well. So we really only have two elements that are inscribed in the text of the Constitution. The rest is a lot of, well, precedent, ceremony, and adherence to tradition. And I think to watch those precedences and those ceremonies and those traditions upended was the most shocking for me in my lifetime. And historically, to find others examples of it was shocking indeed.
Well, you mentioned precedents. Let's go back to the very beginning. You rightly point out that swearing the oath of office is certainly prescribed by the Constitution, has to be there. But what were some of the precedents that, say, George Washington set in motion on Inauguration Day that have found continuity?
Well, that's a great point. And I didn't really talk too much about actually the unique nature of George Washington's inauguration. I would say, for one thing, he was inaugurated on a day that has subsequently never been used again for inauguration. And that's April 30th. Now, again, actually, the day of the day of inauguration was not originally adhered to because of just the way in which the government was coming together. This is after the Constitutional Convention. This is after the ratification of the Constitution, which took time. Not every state had even ratified the Constitution when George Washington was inaugurated. That would be Rhode Island holding out. But the idea was that the government would be put into motion, and there would be this transition between the Articles of Confederation Congress, the Congress, and this new Congress under the Constitution, the Constitutional Congress. And the president was a very different figure than anything that had been in place during the Articles of Confederation. There was a president of the Congress, but it was not an analogous position. This is something new under the sun. And therefore, the inauguration of George Washington, whatever he did, set precedent. So the fact that he took it in public view at what is Federal Hall, the old Federal Hall in New York City, the fact that he did so at noon, although a different date, but that noon would be the time. The fact that he took the oath of office the way he did while placing his hand on a Bible, which is not again prescribed by the Constitution. And there's a whole story of how that Bible got into his hands. It comes from St. John's Masonic Lodge #1 in New York City. That Washington probably said, I think it's recorded, "So help me God," after his inauguration, not in the constitutional oath. It's something, again, he added. That Washington, again, by reporting, kissed the Bible after his inauguration. Not every president has done so, although some have. That Washington gave an inaugural address after his inauguration, again, not provided for. Now, it was inside the congressional chamber. It was not in public view. That's not a precedent he set, but just an act of giving an inaugural address of some kind. after his inauguration. Another precedent would be to attend a church service, which again gets to this sort of religious moment that he lived in, and that presidents have always observed, it seems, pretty much universally since. He went to St. Paul's Chapel in Manhattan. And finally, that idea that there should be inaugural festivities, not so much put into motion by Washington himself, but of course it's by the citizenry, it's by members of the Congress. But the Washingtons did host a reception several days later, and it's arguably the precursor to the inaugural ball. So in many ways, George Washington's presidency set precedents, and I think also it's safe to say he set numerous precedents in respect to Inauguration Day as well.
Yes, as in so many other things, as you rightly point out. And I can't help but ask you this, historian to historian, I'm just curious what you would say, Tom, but what is the inauguration that really is going to signal the most dramatic change in American history? Is it Washington going from a Confederation Congress to under the current Constitution? Is it Lincoln right before the Civil War, toward the end of the Civil War? Is it FDR and the New Deal? Is it, in your mind, what is the most dramatic turning point that an inauguration represents in our history?
Well, I think it's an excellent question. Turning point, this idea that history turns, that there's a turn of events. So I think just to kind of use the phrase, all the episodes I've discussed thus far have been turning points in American history. And I think that's been important to say, and why I highlighted them, is that a change of political party, a change of one administration to the next, is a major turning point in American history. Now, I didn't talk about some of the other turning points where the outgoing did attend his successor's inauguration, but you mentioned a few other significant turning points: the election of Lincoln, the election of Franklin Roosevelt. So to take it all in sum, then, I'm going to go with one of the episodes that I talked about here in the presentation and answer by saying that this would be the election and inauguration of Thomas Jefferson. I think because of what it did to change the nature of the Constitution, it literally led to the 12th Amendment. That's a very significant development, which clarified democracy and actually routinized March 4th at noon, finally, as the time for the president's inauguration. It was the first case of one party changing power, a peaceful transfer of power. It's the first incidence of that as well in American history. And I think presidents and historians look back now to that moment in this so-called revolution, so-called because it was peaceful, of 1800, and it's still the touchstone for all future transitions. We all want to see a kind of peaceful transfer of power, much as we had take place in 1800.
Very interesting. We have some wonderful questions that have come in, Tom, and I'd like to start with this one. In 2009, the oath of office was administered by Chief Justice Roberts to Barack Obama. Unfortunately, one word was out of order when it was stated to President Obama, and they had to redo the oath. Tell us a little bit about that. And also just the person who asked this question, Rachel from Grand Rapids, wants to know if you feel it was necessary to redo the oath due to that one word mistake.
Well, television and the internet has certainly magnified our attention to detail, I would say. And yes, we all noticed it. Those of us watching it live in 2009, I gasped aloud, although I'd be doing a lot more of that, as it turns out, Inauguration Day, that John Roberts missed it. He didn't apparently have the text in front of him. He was working from memory. That's a major mistake. So that was a problem. And it's more of, I think, a blunder in his part than anything that President, of course, elect Obama at that moment did wrong. So it's a 35-word oath. It's not the longest oath in out there. It's not the shortest. So let's get it right. Did President Obama technically need to retake the oath of office? The most literal answer is yes, because without taking the exact oath of office, he did not take the oath of office. And as we've learned, unfortunately, President Obama was subject to a number of conspiracy theories and attacks on every aspect of his person. And one could imagine that had he not done the oath of office precisely to the constitutional parameter, that this would be another, unfortunately, political weapon used against him during his very first days. So it was both politically, I think, the correct move. It was technically and constitutionally required. And I can say that Chief Justice Roberts subsequently has had a text in front of him.
So another question that we have, which I think is really interesting, how many people think about this stuff? Has any book besides the Bible been used when a president has taken the oath of office?
Wow. Let's think about that. The Bible, as we've already learned, is the book that is what George Washington used when he took the oath of office. And so again, in thinking about this question and thinking about, has every president used a Bible? I did some research into this, and the answer is no, which is surprising. I wouldn't say it's the most shocking thing I learned, but it's up there. We don't have a documented instance of several presidents, in fact, taking the oath of office on a Bible. It's not known, for example, if Thomas Jefferson used the Bible. We don't have actual evidence until really the 1850s. And that is to say the surviving Bible that James Buchanan used. Now, John Quincy Adams, we know, did not take the oath of office on a Bible. He chose to use a law book in 1825. So that's one thing, is that the early inaugurations between Jefferson up to Franklin Pierce were not 100% sure. Again, the photographic evidence isn't so clear. The reporting doesn't get to it. We don't have any surviving Bibles in any archives or libraries. So that's one answer. Then there's people in the post 1850s moment presidents who would have wanted to use a Bible, but for various reasons didn't. And so let's get into Theodore Roosevelt. He was he was notified up in the Adirondack Mountains that he might need to become president after the assassination of William McKinley. And he famously hikes down and eventually makes his way to Buffalo. And sure enough, that's where he's inaugurated at the Ainsley Wilcox House. And from, again, surviving documentation, I even checked in with those folks. He did not use a Bible in his swearing in 1901. And it could have been, again, just the rush nature of it all and the circumstances of it being unexpected. Ditto for Lyndon Johnson. For a while, I looked into it. They didn't. People at the time didn't know what Johnson had his hand on Air Force One on that fateful day in November 1963. We've subsequently learned it was not a Bible. It was a prayer book. Actually, that belonged to President Kennedy, and that now has been located, and it's now a precious artifact, of course, from our history. So it appears that the two assassinated presidents and their successors did not use Bibles. Just to say it, then, we have some other instances of Bibles being used, but it just occurred to me that it's sort of like, was one Bible used? No, multiple Bibles were used. We've had cases where Bibles have been stacked, and the most recent one was President Trump using two Bibles, including the Lincoln Bible and a childhood Bible. And we also have President Obama in 2013 using a Bible, the Lincoln Bible, and the Martin Luther King Jr. Bible. So, because it took place on that same day. So it's the case that we've had no Bibles, and we've had more than one Bible, and we've had probably books that weren't Bibles. And again, it's not in the Constitution. It seems to be both personal preference and necessity.
Well, as we know, human beings are meaning-making creatures. The Bible, the book that is used in a swearing in, has incredible symbolic importance. I am curious, this is a quick follow-up. Do we know, you said that John Quincy Adams used a law book of law. Do we know what book that was?
I don't know. I did not find any detail to that. So if anyone knows, and I'll certainly keep digging, we'll have to let you know.
Okay, sounds good. We have another good question in here. What are some of the other countries that hold a similar celebration as our presidential inauguration?
Yeah, the global perspective. Again, this could take a person's lifetime to try to put together an answer to this. Some initial research I've done suggests that perhaps some 55 nations in all have democratically elected presidents who take an oath of office. Now that's, could be a wildly underreported number, but if that's the case, that puts us in good company, first of all. But the thing that I think to point out is the United States did in fact have the very first democratically elected president or chief executive kind of figure, and therefore we do have the very first oath of office on record as well. So in some ways, all the future, any country that followed the example of the United States was therefore following our precedent. I think what's important to say is that there are so many nations that don't therefore seem to have an oath of office because they are monarchies or dictatorships or non-democratic societies. And famously, of course, the American Revolution yielded a kind of constitutional republic. We call it a democracy today because it has evolved. But one thing that the chief executive specifically was written by the constitutional framers not to be was an elected monarch, which is one of the great sets of debates about the Washington, Adams, and Jefferson's era, was to what extent the power of the presidency yielded too much towards monarchy. And so the oath of office, a simple 35-word oath, is very different from the kind of investiture and the rights that a British monarch would take and still takes. We haven't had one in probably our lifetimes, but will take eventually. A new monarch comes in after the death of Queen Elizabeth someday. And it just, you're going to see it. It's a massive event. It's multi-days. It has elements of church and state. Again, something the American Constitution creates a separation of. And so it's I think it's important to show that it is a simple affair, while it's been made into a bigger day in some cases. At its symbolic and most sort of essential meaning, it reflects the democratic tendency that this country was founded on.
Another very interesting question that's come in, Tom, and it asks, if you were to go back in time, what is the inaugural event that you would have wanted to witness yourself? And then what is the ugliest inaugural event that you wouldn't want to have had anything to do with?
Oh boy. Well, I think weather comes to mind. There have been several inaugurations, including President Reagan's second inauguration, where the weather was so cold in Washington, D.C., whether it be January or March, that the inauguration had to be held inside. And that was the case in 1985. So I have a pretty warm coat, but I don't know how long I would do out there. Again, people have reached out to me about their own inaugural experiences. There was a rather unfortunate circumstances for several people who tried to attend President Obama's inauguration in 2009, who were stuck in a tunnel, which is to say the Interstate 395 under Washington, D.C. It's been described as the purple tunnel of doom because these were the purple ticket holders and they were stranded there and for hours in, you can imagine, a very claustrophobic setting. So being on that line, definitely not. Being outside in negative 10-degree weather, definitely not. But there have been some other really kind of wildly tragic, actually, activities on Inauguration Day, like President Grant, when he was inaugurated for a second time in 1872, his inaugural ball, again, a freezing day in Washington, D.C., was held in a building that did not have heat, and people were so cold they kept their coats on. Well, the planners were trying to come up with something kind of delightful for these ball attendees. So they had all in the kind of ceiling canaries in cages to try to sing to the ball attendees. Well, it got so cold that one by one the canaries just froze and died, and in some cases fell to the ground from their cages. So you literally had dead birds raining on you at President Grant's 1873 inaugural. That just sounds like an avoid situation as well.
Boy, that really does paint a grim picture. And of course, he would have his troubles with more than canaries. So Stan Masters from Blissfield has a deuce of questions that I think would be interesting for you to tackle. Which president-elect really wanted his predecessor to attend, and which president-elect did not want his predecessor to be anywhere near? I think you've kind of covered it, but would you rank them that way?
Yeah, those are interesting circumstances. And thinking about the questions, again, it gets to political party and affiliation. I think the presidents who want their predecessors to be there are those of the same party, mostly, for whom there would be a cordial relationship. And certainly I look to the example of Martin Van Buren in 1837. Not only did Van Buren want Jackson there, but they did start the new tradition of the outgoing president and the incoming president riding together to the Capitol. So that was the first time that ever took place, and that's become something of a tradition ever since, that Jackson and Van Buren did together. Similarly, I think in the more modern period, if you're George H.W. Bush and you won an election and you're coming out of the shadow of Ronald Reagan, that you would want President Reagan to attend your inaugural as well. And of course he did. On the other hand, I haven't talked about some of the cases where outgoing presidents attended, but were not necessarily welcomed by the incoming president, but we've actually hinted at one of them. And I would say for sure, this gets us to Franklin Roosevelt and Herbert Hoover, who again fought it out in the election of 1932. Hoover will lose to Roosevelt. And during the period of transition, the last that takes us all the way through March, will attempt to get Roosevelt to rescind some of his New Deal ideas and policies publicly as the nation enters into the worst of the financial crisis that we call the Great Depression. So there was no love lost there. And again, if we had a picture of it, it echoes that Wilson Harding automobile ride. The two men look miserable. Hoover does not want to be there, and Franklin Roosevelt does not want Herbert Hoover there. But again, they were following tradition, and so at least we can say that Hoover did attend. I think similarly, another one that people don't necessarily remember as being particularly fraught is between Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower in 1953. Again, different parties. They weren't running against each other, so there was that. But Harry Truman expected more from Dwight Eisenhower, and particularly around this issue of Joseph McCarthy and his attempted witch hunts, really, on members of society and members of Congress and the military. And Truman, by that point, was all on fighting out against McCarthyism, and he expected Eisenhower in the transition period to make a public claim against McCarthy, and he wouldn't. And so Truman called this moral blindness, which set into motion a rupture between Eisenhower and Truman that took the form of Inauguration Day, where Eisenhower shows up at the White House, which had been traditional, but refuses to go in. And so he will not stand on ceremony. He actually will sit until Harry Truman comes out and joins him in the car, and then they proceed to the Capitol. And actually, unfortunately, Truman and Eisenhower would be at odds with one another for another decade or so. And they really don't come together and kind of mend fences until attending the tragic, again, funeral of President Kennedy in 1963. And then there is a brief kind of period where they seem to be back in contact and kind of have put aside some of their differences. So there have been moments where you would imagine, if you're President Eisenhower elect, you don't want Truman there and you're just doing it out of ceremony. But at least, again, in both instances, both did attend their successors' inaugurations.
Very good. Well, this will be our last submitted question, Tom. And it goes like this. While the importance of Inauguration Day is widely acknowledged, televised on radio, internet, it's safe to say that many Americans are not aware of all the things that are going on behind the scenes to get to that point. For example, certifying electoral college votes. Do you think, your personal opinion now, do you think that more attention will be given to the process, the democratic process leading up to the inauguration than has been accorded in the past?
I think American politics, but particularly around anything related to elections in America, is a touchy subject. And the Electoral Count Act, as it was conceived, made sense in the 1880s based on the very contested election between the successful Republican nominee, Rutherford B. Hayes, and the Democratic nominee, Samuel Tilden, which led to a deadlock, which led to a constitutional crisis, because unlike the previous elections where the House of Representatives decided, we had instead a question about the authenticity of the electoral returns from 3 states, all in the South, all which had been under Reconstruction, under military rule, and eventually all which will flip Republican and give Hayes the victory by 1 vote. So when the Democrats come into power under Grover Cleveland, this is on their agenda. I mean, actually, the Electoral Count Act wouldn't pass under a Republican administration. They benefited, Hayes did, and Garfield, although it wasn't as contested, would have, arguably. And so, we need the party system to be strong. We need the 2 parties to propose legislation and to debate that legislation, but it shouldn't be the last word. The fact that the Electoral Count Act is still how we run and process elections more than 140 years later, or almost 140 years later, is a problem. Legislation should be updated and changed. One would hope that it would be bipartisan in nature, but it doesn't have to be. I mean, again, the Electoral Count Act is a democratic 1880s Democrats piece of legislation. And in its usage and deployment, as we saw in 2021, it revealed itself to be fraught. And I think anyone who studies the act and saw what happened would want to suggest changes, would want to potentially compress the timeline, would want to make the nature of objections to certification, say, less formulaic, giving sort of less time to debate. And again, those are rules. So I would say this is not in the Constitution. It's just a piece of legislation. It can also be changed by legislation.
Tom, thank you for fielding those really good questions from a variety of sources. And you've been so enlightening about the nature of our inaugurations. It seems that really they're kind of a thermometer that takes the temperature of the body politic. You know, do we have a high fever, a lot of tumult and distress in the body politic, or is it a calmer period of time? I'm wondering if you have any concluding thoughts about inaugurations and their role in American history, or what they might portend for America's future and our democracy.
Well, I think it's important to say that why we care so much about Inauguration Day is it is the one symbolic moment of the transfer of power. Sure, the election is the kind of plebiscite where the people speak and get to make their voice known, and it's raucous, and it's in fact the kind of loud democracy that so many of us love. We love this stuff. We love elections. We love being able to participate in democracy. It's one of our few civic duties that we get to exercise every year. In some cases, more than once. Vote in your special elections as well, of course. And so inauguration is now on this quadrennial cycle, or some such version of it, every 4 years, and it gives renewal and hope. It gives the idea that something is different is possible. I think it's difficult to be on the losing end of a tough election. And it's been the case that many presidents have attempted to unify the country behind their program, behind their election. And some have been more successful than others, both within our lifetimes and in the past. So looking at, again, what we saw today, the Adamses set a very bad example, I think, by not at least showing up at the table. But look at the outcome. You had Jefferson and his successors, and you had Jackson and his successors. So without getting into policy and anything like that, let's just say democracy held for a generation in the subsequent absence. And it can be said too that after Johnson's absence at Grant's inauguration, we have a stable two-party system in place. And I think if that's the goal, is having stability, and the goal is to be able to have a peaceful transfer of power, if the goal is to ultimately keep our democracy, to riff off the famous phrase, it's a democracy if you can keep it. If the goal is to keep it, then Inauguration Day is supremely important, because it in fact is the moment where we get to reset the scale, where we get to cool down that thermometer that has been heated up by the loudness of elections, and to hopefully be future oriented as a people.
Thank you, Dr. Thomas Balcerski, for such an enlightening, engaging, really an enjoyable presentation and give and take in this previous hour. Really enjoyed it. I think our viewers, judging from the questions, also enjoyed it tremendously. It's now my honor to introduce our newly appointed director of the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library and Museum, Brooke Clement.
Dr. Balcerski, what a wonderful program. Thank you for highlighting the history and mishaps of some presidential inaugurations for us. For anyone interested in finding out more on President Ford's swearing-in ceremony, please visit the digital collection on the Library and Museum's website. Before I close tonight's program, I would like to thank the Friends of Ford for your continued support of the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Library and Museum. The museum in Grand Rapids is opening a new feature exhibit next week. Women in Uniform showcases rarely displayed art from the Naval History and Heritage Command's collection. The paintings feature women in uniform throughout the 20th and 21st centuries. On Monday, January 24th at 7 p.m., please join us virtually as we welcome Rear Admiral retired Samuel J. Cox, the Director of Naval History and Heritage Command, and his colleague, Gail Monroe, the curator of the Naval Art Gallery. During the program, they will give a brief history of the role women played in naval history and give background on selected works from the exhibition. To register, visit fordlibrarymuseum.gov. Thank you for attending tonight's lecture, and we look forward to seeing you next week.